Well, good morning to everyone again. The last time we met, I began a series in the book of Nehemiah. In part one, I covered the book of the Nehemiah from the perspective of a man of prayer. We went into some historical background. We discussed the time of the kings of Persia. We discussed the time of Nehemiah when he began to serve before Artaxerxes in 465 BC. We went through the man of character. We talked about how he was diligent, how his prayers and his thoughts went to those of his own people and back to Jerusalem, even though that he was in a very high position before the king, and that his own comforts were tremendous. When you're working in the king's household and you're the king's cupbearer, you're treated very well. And then you actually have servants of your own. And at the same time, even though he was there, his mind wasn't settled. His heart wasn't what it needed to be, because he kept thinking back to Jerusalem and the condition that they were in. In Nehemiah chapter 1 and verse 3, in a review here, it talked about those who had came to Nehemiah, and he asked for the conditions. In verse 3 it says in chapter 1 of Nehemiah, "And they said unto me, the remnant who are left in the captivity of the province are in great affliction." And we drew an analogy to try to understand that the duality of time in the book of Nehemiah also points forward to a time before the return of Christ. That the remnant, even though God says He will spare His elect, Isaiah talks about a very small remnant who are left. He talks about the remnant and the condition that they were in. When we put that in perspective of the remnant who were left here in New Orleans after Katrina, talking about a microcosm of what the events were going to be like before the return of Jesus Christ, is that it's like no one came through this unscathed. So when we look at this, we talked about the remnant who were left in the captivity in the province. They were in great affliction and reproach. And the walls of Jerusalem were broken down, and the gates were burned with fire. We talked about how this affected Nehemiah, and that he immediately went to God in prayer. In verse 4 it says, "And it came to pass that when I heard these words, I sat down and I wept." I remember when we had to flee from New Orleans during the hurricane. And I'm using that as the reference point because that's what brought my mind to the study in the book of Nehemiah, to try to get a perspective of what it is that God has for us here. Is that we had to flee New Orleans. We went up to Alabama, and unknowing to us that the hurricane literally followed us up there. And so after it passed New Orleans, the very next day of that night, it began to come across where we were staying up, about 100 miles north of Tuscaloosa, Alabama. And when that hurricane came through, it literally, even that area, almost 400 miles from New Orleans, knocked out 90,000 homes with power. The home where we were staying on this country road, the trees had fallen, the wires were down. We had no power even up there from this hurricane for 4 days. And the very first time we got to see anything with television as to what was going on, all we had was a little portable radio with batteries. And at night we can catch WWL, and that's the only news and information we had. We were cut off on a road that had no power, no way to get in and get out until the community came and they cut the roads and took the trees out the way so we could at least get in and out. But the very first thing I saw when we turned on the television, they got cable back up there, is they were showing the city in fire. That morning there was this huge fire along the riverfront. And sometime later in the day there were several businesses in the business district of the city, and it was on fire. And then later during that morning, they were showing some homes that were going up in fire. And so the city was breaking out in flames. And I looked at this, and I thought about what I was witnessing. And it just try to put things in perspective. Understanding prophecy is difficult if you can't get your mind around what it is that God is telling us. And it's the same way when Jesus Christ began to preach, is that He would speak to people in parables where they couldn't quite grasp what He was saying. But when He would talk to His disciples, He would explain it so that the mind could understand what it was Jesus wanted them to know. And so it is with prophecy. It's like he tells Daniel. Daniel had all this information given to him. He could see it, but he couldn't understand it. And God tells Daniel, go your way, for the book is sealed until the end. Now, we're getting close to the end. And I believe that Nehemiah is one of those books that deals with prophecy that helps us, as we get closer and closer to an end time, to reveal information of conditions and how things will be like before the return of Jesus Christ. It also tells us the kind of character we're going to have to get us through what lies ahead. It also shows us that without the connection to God and in daily communication before Him in prayer, we're not going to make it during that tribulation period. And that's probably the most basic of the understandings of Nehemiah. In Nehemiah, his example is the man of prayer. So now God gives us the insight into Nehemiah, his condition, his heart, his state of mind, and the very next thing we begin to see in the middle of it all, that he didn't look around him and feel so helpless that he couldn't do anything. We see a man emerging in the middle of all the chaos as a man of vision. And part 2, and that's what I want to talk about today, is Nehemiah, a man of vision. So now, let's back up now in verse 4, chapter 1, and pull the story together again, like we did last time. And this time we want to look at it not from the prayer perspective, but the concept of what he needed to do. He had a plan. He had vision. Here he was. Now try to understand what we're talking about. Here's a man who's a captive before a Persian king in a high place. Now he can't do anything without the permission of the king and his authority. So now let's look at his vision and what he wanted and how God had placed it in his heart to get the job done. Because you see, Nehemiah was an end-time book before we see Jesus Christ come to this earth as Messiah. Now, chapter 1, verse 4. It came to pass that when I heard these words, he talked about how Jerusalem was broken down, the gates were burned with fire. It came to pass that when I heard these words, that I sat and I wept and I mourned certain days. Doesn't tell us how long he mourned yet, but he sat and he wept and he mourned. Now, in the middle of this, while he's praying and he's fasting and he's mourning, his mind is beginning to develop a plan. Now, try to imagine this man being a captive, a plan on how he's going to rebuild Jerusalem. From what he heard, a man who is actually a captive goes before God and petitions God, and you'll begin to see in chapter 2 what this plan is all about. Actually, beginning well, I'll get there in just a second. So now let's go on here, and he says, and I prayed before the God of heaven. And I said, I beseech you, O Lord, God of heaven, the great and inspiring God who keeps covenant and mercy for them who love him and observe his commandments. He knew the key. He knew what he needed to do before God in his prayers so that God would answer him. And he was patient to wait for an answer. The very next thing he does, and you see in verse 8, he reminds God of his own words. He knew that once he repented and he admitted his sins, admitted the sins of his family and his nation, and he put it all before God and he asked to be cleansed, he reminds God, verse 8 and verse 9, he says, God, you told us that if we do this, even though we're scattered around, we're scattered abroad across the face of the earth, that you will pull us back together again. And he reminds God of his own words, the boldness that he has before God. And he can do it because he had a pure heart. He admitted who he was. He admitted the sins that he had committed. And he admitted that he wanted to do something about it. And he waited. Verse 9 it says, but if you return unto me and keep my commandments and do them, this is God's own words, he says, then do them, though you were cast out to the uttermost part of heaven, yet I will gather them from there, and I will bring them to the place that I've chosen to set my name. And in part 1, I tried to remind everybody to look forward to prophecy, and we're seeing what God's talking about when His Son returns again. How He's going to have to go out, and it says He sends His angels to the four corners of the earth, and He gathers His elect, and He brings them to where He's going to be, as His feet stand on the Mount of Olives. And He's going to rebuild. And there it says we shall rule with Him. And we went through Revelation, where God says we're going to be kings and priests, or a kingdom of priests. And we're going to rule with Him on this earth. And then He goes before God and He says, Lord, I beseech you. And He petitions before God and He waits. And He's becoming, he is so patient. It's amazing. We pick up the story now, chapter 2. We just kind of touched on this in part 1. And I want to go into this time frame just a little more detail this time, as we did last, like we did last time. Chapter 2 and verse 1 says, and it came to pass in the month of Nisan. Now remember that he was before God praying in chapter 1, verse 1, in the month of Chislev. So if you go to the calendar and you look at the months on the calendar, you'll see that depending on when he began his prayer and when he actually got his audience before the king, it's somewhere between 4 to 5 months. And so safely, let's say that he had been praying, he had fasted off and on, he had mourned, and he had petitioned God in prayer, it says, day and night. Approximately 4 months has transpired. And now, through his patience, God grants him an audience before the king. And that's what we're reading here in chapter 2, verse 1. In the 20th year of Artaxerxes, the king, that the wine was before him, that I took up the wine, and I gave it to the king. Now I had not been sad in his presence. And therefore the king said unto me, why is your countenance sad, seeing that you're not sick? He says, there is nothing else but sorrow in the heart. Then I was very much afraid. And I said unto the king, let the king live forever. Why should not my countenance be sad, when the city, the place of my father's sepulchres, lies in wait, and his gates are consumed with fire? He begins to tell the king exactly what it is and why he was sad. Then the king said unto me, for what do you make your request? And so I prayed to the God of heaven. Immediately, he goes right to God in prayer. God gives him an audience before the king. The king looks at what he's going through. He sees his condition. Nehemiah tells him what's going on. And now the king says, well, what is it that you need? And he didn't just give him an answer. Immediately inside himself, and this is probably one of those times that it was a silent prayer between him and God. I doubt seriously that he would sit there and just stop and say a prayer right before the king. But he said it to himself in all probability. He says, so I prayed to the God of heaven, and I said unto the king, if it please the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, that you would send me to Judah unto the city of my father's sepulchres, that I may build it. For all those months that he's been in prayer, he didn't sit back and say, what can I do? I'm just a servant. I'm a captive. I can't do anything. It's hopeless. Let somebody else do something for him. He was in prayer before God. One man that God had put the desire in his heart, and he began to formulate a plan. And the Bible shows us this plan that was in his mind while he's yet a captive. And that's why I'm saying that Nehemiah was also not just a man of prayer, but he was a man of vision. And at the feast, if you haven't heard it, I believe we've got it on tape in a Bible study, and if not, maybe Mr. Ian Houghton can do it again. He gave a study on prayer. It's talking about the working prayer. It isn't just sitting back and praying to God, just forget about it. But you got to put your prayers to work. You just can't just be haphazard about it. One of the things that I find interesting about this with prayer with Nehemiah, when the time went by, It may be that sometimes God doesn't answer our prayers because He wants to see if we're really diligent about what it is we're asking for. For example, say, God, please help me do this. And then you just go back out and you just do what you've been doing. But you don't try to struggle. You don't have a plan to develop to overcome whatever it is that's holding you back, that you're struggling to overcome. It might be a person uses foul language, let's say. And so you say, well, I slipped my tongue. And from time to time, I'll be around church people. And you'll hear some vulgarities that will come out and people go, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to say that. Well, see, that's a habit that's got to be overcome. Where God talks about no profane things should come out of our lips because it's in our hearts. So that means it's in your past. It's in your mind. It has to be struggled to overcome. And you got to work at it. And you got to go before God in prayer. And if you're not working at it, why would God want to help if you really don't care about it? So you want to be able to follow through. Maybe, for example, someone who wants to play a musical instrument. That if you don't practice, you're never going to develop the talent to play that music. Those stories where we see someone said, I've never picked up an instrument before, and he began playing it. Well, I believe that can happen, but that's awful rare. Most everybody else has really got to study. Maybe it's that you've been playing this. Well, I've been wanting to read the Bible and read it through this year, and you say that every year, but you don't do it. It's something you have to work at. You have to put your mind and your heart to. And so for 4 months, Nehemiah had put his mind and his heart and developed a plan. And that God, when it was time, God came to him and gave him the opportunity to follow it through. So he's asking the king to go back and build the city of Jerusalem. In verse 6, it says, And the king said unto me, the queen also sitting by him, How long shall your journey be? And when will you return? He evidently was interested. He seemed to have an appreciation of Nehemiah. He probably was a man who was upbeat. He was probably very positive. He was an educated man, as we understand from reading in chapter 1, that when he went to God in prayer, that his mind went back into the Scriptures, and he can relate almost word for word what God had written in the books as it related to God in his prayer. So he was an educated man. And he goes on to say, When will you be returned? And so it pleased the king to send me, and I set him a time. God answers his prayer. And this man, while he's yet a captive in a foreign nation, has the vision and the insight to rise above his condition and do the work of God. Now that's what we need to see as a people, as a work, as a church, as a body of believers, is to be able to look at the conditions that are around us and rise up above that, and knowing that God has a plan and that we can overcome whatever obstacle has been put in our way. No matter what someone says about you, no matter what the struggle is to overcome, we can overcome. God says all things are possible for him who believes. And I believe that. And I believe that God's going to give us a work, a powerful work. If we convert just one person, if God gives that opportunity to bring one person to repentance and to baptize one more person, then the work has not been in vain. The work of God must go on despite the obstacles and those that want to destroy it. And I promise you, Satan wants to destroy the work of God in the worst way. He knows he has but a short time. And he knows the only thing that stands in his way in the plan of God is God's people. Jesus Christ has already overcame this earth. The only thing left for him to do was destroy the work that Jesus Christ died to build. All right, now let's go on. That's just one of the stories of Nehemiah. Nehemiah was a man of vision. He has the permission, and he's ready to go do the job. Moreover, I said unto the king. Now remember I said a few minutes ago he had developed a plan? Now watch, he begins to take his plan now, and he begins to unveil it to the king. Moreover, I said unto the king, If it please the king, let letters be given to me, to the governors beyond the river, that they may let me pass through until I come to Judah. a letter unto Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me timber to make beams for the gates of the palace, which is near to the house, and for the wall of the city, and for the house that I shall enter into. And the king granted me according to the good hand of my God upon me. Now remember, when the people came to him, Nehemiah was told how the city was in ruin. It was broken down. The walls were broken. The gates were burned. Basically, there was nothing there except for certain stones that they could use to rebuild. So in his mind, during those months of prayer, he began to develop a plan. Well, what would he need? He's going to have a certain amount of materials. He just can't go back to Jerusalem and build. New Testament tells us, how can you build unless you count the cost? And so when the king says, what will you need? He said, first of all, I need a letter from you, king, that gives me permission to pass through to rebuild Jerusalem. Because, see, these governors weren't going to let him through until he had this pass. And I need materials to build with. And so he actually asked the king, this is amazing, he asked the king to use the king's forest to cut down the trees and to go build Jerusalem. And it's interesting, he asked for one more thing, how subtle he is. He's going to see that he's asking enough material so that he could build the palace. Now, who lives in the palace? Well, the king. So he's actually saying that I'm going to build Jerusalem, the walls and the gates, and I'm also going to build a place, king, for you and your palace. And actually we'll see later that he probably lived in that palace as he was building it, because those around him, there were many. And he had to have a place that was large enough to be able to feed all the workers that was at his table, it says. So verse 8, he asked a letter to Asaph. In verse 7, he asked for a letter for the governors to pass that he comes into Jerusalem. In verse 9 now, then I came to the governors beyond the river, and I gave them the king's letters. And now the king had sent captains of the army and horsemen. Now, we begin to see some opposition. Now, but before we get into the opposition, I want to bring out something that's very important here in the book of Nehemiah. Now, if you go back and you read in 2 Chronicles and you read in Ezra, you see that there's a decree from King Cyrus to go back and to rebuild Jerusalem. But there's no order given as far as a proclamation or a letter saying, this is yours, go back and build. The proclamation from Cyrus was a decree by the king to go back into Jerusalem. Now, if you look at the timing was about 538 BC, and you go into prophecies, you'll find that that time of that proclamation is not the same as the one you're going to read in Daniel. So now I want you to save your spot here in Nehemiah. We want to save this spot, and we want to go to the book of Daniel. Because remember I told you the timing is very, very important of what we're talking about around 445 BC. So now save your spot in Nehemiah and understanding, let's go into Daniel and to see, because you see in the book of Nehemiah is the only place where we find that there was a letter written to go back and rebuild the walls and the gates of Jerusalem, where Ezra went back and he began to rebuild the temple. And that's a different story. So now let's go to Daniel chapter 9. And we're going to begin reading in verse 20. All right? Daniel 9, verse 20. And while I was speaking and praying and confessing my sin and the sin of my people, Israel. Notice that each time these prophets... Now God called Daniel a man greatly beloved. In fact, in one chapter alone, I think he says it 3 times. He says, Daniel, you're greatly beloved before God. He's doing the exact same thing here that we read in Daniel that Nehemiah does later. Is he confesses his sins first. And one of the keys, if you want to answer prayer, you go to God and ask him to search your heart, like King David did. If there's anything that's impure, if there's anything of the sin that's there, ask God to remove it. Remove it. Just get it out. Confess your sins before God so that God can come back in and fill with a perfect heart. Because you see, the Spirit of God can't dwell where there's evil. They can't take up the same house. So you've got to purge whatever's there. And sometimes that isn't done easily, especially if there's grievances or grudges. And that's why we see in the New Testament, God tells us, if you've got aught against your brother, you better go make peace first. Lay your gift at the foot of the altar, it says. Go make peace with your brother, and then come back. And that's the principle that we're reading here in Daniel and that we read in Nehemiah before the prayer. It says, while I was speaking and praying and confessing my sin and the sin of my people Israel, and presenting my supplication before the Lord my God for the holy mountain of God. See, this prayer was for God, for the holy mountain of God. And yes, while I was speaking in the prayer, even the man Gabriel, whom I have seen in the vision at the beginning, being caused to fly swiftly, touched me about the hour of the evening oblation. And he informed me, and he talked with me and said, O Daniel, I am now come forth to give you skill and understanding. At the beginning of your supplications, the commandment came forth, and I am come forth to show you, for you are greatly beloved. Therefore understand the matter and consider the vision. Now, verses 24 and 25 is very important to the understanding of the prophecy in relationship to Nehemiah. Now look at 24, see what it says. 70 weeks are determined upon thy people and upon the holy city to finish the transgression. I'm talking about how Israel had gone into captivity and previously, and now Judah had gone into captivity. And there was a period of time that had to be finished for the transgression, and to make an end of sins, and to make a reconciliation for iniquity. Now there's only one time that's recorded in the history of man that there is a reconciliation of sin by an individual, and that is Jesus Christ. He is the one who reconciles us back to God to make an end of sins. And there's a period of time, it says, of 70 weeks are determined, and to bring in everlasting righteousness. So that means there's two parts of this prophecy. Is that there's going to be a time of coming in of the reconciliation, and the time into everlasting righteousness, even though in prophetic understanding and principle, is that when a person has been redeemed by God and he's died, well, he has eternal life, even though the everlasting has not yet come back, if you understand what I'm talking about. And this is why you'll see later in the verses, it'll talk about at the midst of the week being cut off. Now let's go on to say, to bring in everlasting righteousness. Now we know that's got to be of Jesus Christ, because he's the only one that can do that. And to seal up the vision of the prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. Now we see that in the New Testament with the coming of Jesus Christ. Now there's no doubt what we're talking about here. But there had to be a coming of an appointed time for this to take place. Now the only time we see anything recorded from a king to go back into Jerusalem to rebuild its walls is from King Artaxerxes to the letters to Nehemiah to go back and do that for rebuilding Jerusalem. See what verse 25 says. Know and therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem unto the Messiah. So there had to be an appointed time. There had to be for the 70 weeks. If you go back to Cyrus, it doesn't fit within the time frame of what we're talking about. There's a period of almost 80 to 100 years difference. So that time period was going back to reestablish the temple. The time to rebuild Jerusalem is coming from Nehemiah when he goes back to build the walls to protect the city, to bring back the inhabitants. Because until the time of Nehemiah, things were still in ruin. The work had almost come to a complete stop. The condition of the people was in ruin, and the condition of Jerusalem was in dismay. We read that in Nehemiah chapter 1. So here it says that therefore, and understand that from the time going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem unto the Messiah, the Prince, shall be 7 weeks. 7 weeks. And 62 weeks, that's another period of time. And it will go on, you'll see, in verse 27, it talks about another week. So if you go through and you got 7 weeks, and 62 weeks is 69 weeks, and then in verse 27 you had 1 more week, you have a total period of 70 weeks. Now there's something we need to understand about timing. So hold your spot here now. Let's go back to understanding a little bit about time, and this is where we come up with the 490 years. You go back into Genesis, see, and we're talking about the interplay between a day and a year, or when you're talking about the 70 weeks, and 70 times 7 is 490, that's 449 days, or a day is a year, 490 years. Now let me show you where we pick up this information to try to understand that prophecy. Now, Genesis 29, and we'll pick up the story with the story of Rachel and the story of Jacob and Leah. Okay? We'll start in verse 16. Laban had 2 daughters, and the name of the elder was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. And Leah was tender-eyed, but Rachel was beautiful and well-favored. And Jacob loved Rachel, and said, I will serve you 7 years for Rachel, the younger daughter. Now, there's no doubt, every theologian, you probably know, 7 years is 7 years. And he literally worked for Laban. You know the story. I won't go through the whole story. But you know, he literally worked for 7 years. And then at the time of his wedding, which is probably a lot to be said about drinking too much on your wedding night, when he woke up the next morning, he had the older sister. He didn't have Rachel. And he had to work for Rachel for another 7 years to get her. So now let's pick the story up in verse 26. So look what Laban says. And Laban said, it must not be so done in our country to give you the younger before the firstborn. Fulfill her week. See what he says? Fulfill her week. 7 days. And we will give you this also for the service which you shall serve me yet another 7 years. So here we see the principle of Jacob actually serving another 7 years or a week. And so Jacob did so and fulfilled her week, and he gave her Rachel, his daughter, and his wife also. Now this is also talking about her week being the time of a newlywed and the things that they go through. But the week and the year are the interchangeable items here. Now let's go back to Daniel. Because what we're looking at is that from the time that God gave the order, somewhere between the decree, because it says in Daniel 25, know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and build Jerusalem, the only place we find that there's a written record of restoring Jerusalem is given to Nehemiah. Now, we don't know the exact time period that the order was given until Nehemiah actually got it. But if you look at from 445 BC, somewhere about that time or right before that, until the prophecies that we've seen of the Messiah coming in for the redemption, for the reconciliation, because Jesus Christ is one who reconciles us back to Him, until the crucifixion of Christ, you have 69 weeks until His ministry. And then it goes on to say, Daniel 9, verse 27, it says, and he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice of the oblation to cease. And we know that's a duality in itself, is that Jesus Christ in His 7-year ministry, which also you magnify this 7-year period to 7,000 years, when you magnify the time, you know that He was coming in the midst of the 7,000 years, and at the end of the 3.5 days, which is in the middle of it, He was cut off. It also means that He was cut off in the midst of the week, which is actually a physical time, where He was crucified on Wednesday. So we actually have the 69.5 weeks, or the 70 weeks would be complete, until the everlasting is set in place, which is at the return of Jesus Christ the second time, which completes the 70 weeks in spiritual. It also is completed in the 70 weeks in the physical at the time of Christ when He came, from the time that the order went out. Now that's a side note, but it's important to understand of what was taking place here. Because you see, Nehemiah was given that commission. God doesn't give a job like that to someone who's just haphazard about what he needs to do. Now think about something. Is there something in your life that you feel strong about? That you just don't seem to put much effort to it? Then you need to get about doing something about it. You go before God and you begin seriously in prayer. Maybe it's simply to help one another, to serve one another. Maybe it's simply to help somebody through a difficult time. Think about it. Because you see, God's not going to use you if you're not serious about what it is He has called you to do. And so, those 4 months, God evaluated the prayer. And it says that in Nehemiah, and later in his words we'll read in the next 2 sermons, is that Nehemiah said that God had put it in his heart. He doesn't take any credit for it. He gives it all to God. Now let's go back now to Nehemiah chapter 2 and looking at the vision that this man actually had in Nehemiah chapter 2. And let's pick up the story in verse 9. Then I came to the governors beyond the river, and I gave them the king's letter. Now the king had sent captains of the army and the horsemen with me. So he leaves this cushy job he has. He has a plan in his mind. We don't know exactly what the plan is, but he's beginning to develop and unfold it for us. He crosses the rivers, and he goes through the different governors. He said, I come to the governors beyond the river. He gives them the king's letter. And the king had sent the captains and the armies with me. Then Sanballat and Onrite and Tobiah the servant and the Ammonite heard it. It grieved them exceedingly. Now you would think that if there was someone coming to help build and to restore, that would make everybody really happy. But it didn't. Because you see, there's a lot of evil. And a lot of people who are corrupt in this life. And just like the return of Christ, when He comes, there's going to be a lot of people who's going to be very unhappy. And in fact, we see that there's a multitude of approximately 200 million people who are going to rise up and try to fight Jesus Christ when He comes. Satan is not going to give up very easy to the power and the control he has over this world. And he's going to fight you and I, who stand up for God Almighty, to let them know that this world is evil. It's corrupt. It's got to go. There needs to be a new coming king and a new order coming. Not the world order we hear that's going on right now on the news and in the internet, but we're talking about the coming kingdom of God. That is the new world order that's coming. Nothing that we're going to build ourselves. There's not a thing that we can put together here of our own that's ever going to do that. It's going to take Jesus Christ coming back to this earth. So these men were very upset. It says, and it grieved them exceedingly that there had come a man to seek the welfare of the children of Israel. Doesn't that astonish you? That actually someone was worried about the welfare of the people, and it bothers these people? That astounds me every time I read this scripture. So I came to Jerusalem, and he was there for 3 days. And I arose in the night. See, his plan, he wanted to do something, but he wasn't sure yet who he could trust or what he needed to actually get done. So he begins at nighttime, I and some few men with me, and neither told I any man what God had put in my heart to do at Jerusalem. So he admits and he understands that the plan that he had, God gave it to him. And he was going to fulfill that commission that God had put in his heart to do at Jerusalem. Neither was there any beast with me except the beast that I rose. And so I went out by night, and by the gate of the valley, even before the jackal's wall. So now, if we've got a graph, and we'll pull it up and we'll put it in here, and hopefully you can see it at home, is that when you pull up this graph and you look at Jerusalem, you'll see it, how it's designed. And what they're able to do is historically now, is they're able to go back and they can take, when he lists how he went around Jerusalem, And you can see from the graph how it goes around. And you see that he goes from gate to gate. And he begins to survey the city of Jerusalem and what it's going to take to get the job done at nighttime when there's no one else near him. And he begins to clearly see the condition of what he's up against. So he begins to see what's going to take to rebuild Jerusalem and the walls that were there. So he says, I went out, in verse 13, I went out by night by the gate of the valley, even before the Jackal's wall, and to the Dung's gate, and I viewed the walls of Jerusalem, which were broken down, and the gates which were consumed by fire. And now, he begins to see what he was up against and the conditions of the city. And also that we have another graph I want to put up. And in this graph you begin to see the size of some of these gates. Because there is a wall from the original wall of Solomon that's still there. And in that there's some gates that's there. And you can begin to see how big and how massive these gates were and how high these walls were that they had to go back to restore and to build. Now, he was a cupbearer. It doesn't say he had all the skills to do the job, but what he had was the faith and the confidence to know that God had put it in his heart and that God wasn't going to fail him. Despite whatever obstacle he came up against, he was going to be able to get the job done. And he was now out pursuing how he was actually going to do it. So he says, Then I went on to the gate of the fountain and to the king's pool, but there was no place for the beast that was under me to pass. It was falling down so bad that he actually had to get off his beast and walk to be able to go underneath it because it was in such decay. Then I went up in the night by the brook, and I viewed the wall, and I turned back, and I entered the gate into the valley, and so I returned. And the rulers knew not where I went, nor what I did, and neither yet had I told it to the Jews, nor to the priests, nor to the nobles, nor to the rulers, nor to the rest who did the work. He was confident enough to know he didn't have to go out and play politics. God gave him a job. He went out and surveyed what the job was going to take. And he went and he did it alone. And as he did this, he was preparing in his mind how he was going to go about to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem and how he was going to be able to overcome those obstacles. He says, Then I said unto them, You see the distress that we are in, and how Jerusalem lies in waste, and its gates are burned with fire. Come, let us build the wall of Jerusalem, that we be no more a reproach. So now when he did it all, he finally comes to the people, and he gathers them together, and he says, You see the condition we're in. Now, it doesn't tell us here how bad the condition really is. But the Bible shows us a little later, and I want to turn there now. I'm going to come back here in just a second. Same book, just a couple chapters over. Go to chapter 5. I want to give you an idea of the condition of what he saw when he was there. Now, chapter 5 is almost like an inset chapter during the rebuilding, and how the people are in such dismay, they're coming before him to tell him how bad things really are. Now look at chapter 5, and we'll begin reading in verse 1. And there was a great cry of the people and of their wives against the brethren of the Jews. This is the condition of the people inside Jerusalem. Remember, this is some almost 80 years after Ezra had already been back to start rebuild the temple, and how bad the conditions had gotten, even after Cyrus said it was okay to go back. And because the work had seemed to come to a halt. And this is the condition the people were in. And the wives were against the brethren of the Jews. Therefore were those who said, We, our sons, our daughters, are many. Therefore we take up the grain for them that we may eat and live. They were starving to death inside the city. Some also were there who said, We have mortgaged our lands, our vineyards, our houses, that we might buy grain because of the famine. They were starving. There wasn't much food, the famine in the land. They couldn't pay the taxes. There was no income coming in. There was no work. There was no jobs. And so they began to mortgage, to those who had a little, their homes and everything they owned. There were also there who said, we have borrowed money for the king's tax. So they were paying high taxes. There was no money coming in, and yet they had to continually pay for the king's taxes that are upon our lands and our vineyards. Yet now our flesh is as the flesh of our brethren, and our children as their children. And lo, we bring into bondage our sons and our daughters. It had gotten so bad that there was no food. They mortgaged their lands. They mortgaged their homes. When there was nothing else to mortgage and they still had to pay for the taxes and buy food, they sold their children into slavery. This is the condition that's inside Jerusalem. So now, save your spot. Let me go back to Nehemiah chapter 1. Now, Nehemiah chapter 1. Now, let's give you some insight of what it was that Nehemiah felt now and what the message was that came to him. Remember Nehemiah 1, verse 3, when he was asking, what are the conditions in Jerusalem? And they said unto me, the remnant who are left of the captive in the province are in great affliction. See, now we're beginning to read what kind of affliction they're in. And reproach, and the wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and the gates are burned with fire. See, people weren't going to move back to Jerusalem because there was no protection. And you hear around New Orleans, even now, months after the hurricane, people said, unless you get the levees around the city built stronger than they were before, we're not coming back. And in essence, that's what the gates were, and the walls of Jerusalem. The people were saying that we have no way to protect ourselves. And the kings keeps coming in and pillaging and just burning and taking everything from these people. And they said, we're not coming back to Jerusalem. And so it goes on to say, it says, and it came to pass when I heard these words, I sat and I mourned for certain days. So now in chapter 5, let's go back to chapter 5, we begin to see why he was mourning. He's looking at the condition of these people. He looked at himself and he was in a cushy job. And he couldn't stand it because he looked at his family, the place of his fathers, he says, and look at the condition. And he looked at himself. He said, how can I be here when there's so much going on down there? I need to be down there and help these people. The insight and the vision of Nehemiah is something for an end time that God is going to call upon you and I. And we may have cushy jobs. We may have a home where there's going to be others who have nothing. And God's going to look at our heart and see, where does our effort lie? Do we serve? Can we help? Or do we just close our eyes, turn off the news, turn off the TV, turn off the lights, and go our merry way? Well, God's people suffer. I mean, there's a story here that we need to understand. And I was talking with a minister the other night, and I said, I don't believe we've done an adequate job of preparing the leadership as well as the members to prepare for the coming calamities, what's going to take place. In our minds, when you read, God says, no harm will come nigh thy dwelling, you think nothing's going to happen to you. Well, you don't know that that's going to be the case. And there's probably going to be cases when God will have total protection upon certain individuals. But when you look at what they've gone through historically in the Old Testament, the time of Jesus Christ, and those afterwards, and the prophecies, you can understand that there's coming great tribulation even upon God's people. There's going to be a martyrdom that's going to take place, and that there's going to be suffering. And I believe that God's laying it in our hearts. And some of the lessons I've learned from going through Katrina, that the way to get through this is to help others. Yes, you got your own problems, but they're going to be there anyway. And it's through the help of others that God gives you the strength of spirit to be able to overcome your own obstacles. And this is what Nehemiah is doing here. It goes on to say, it says, and yes, the flesh of our brethren, our children, and lo, we bring into bondage our sons and our daughters to be servants, and some of our daughters are brought into bondage already. They'd already begun to sell their daughters into bondage. And neither is there any power to redeem them. See, once you were sold into slavery, you had a chance to buy people back. But he's saying, we don't have the money. there's no way that we could ever buy our daughters back or redeem them from slavery. It says, there is nothing in our power to redeem them, for other men have our lands and our vineyards. In verse 6, we begin to see again the character of Nehemiah. And I was very angry when I heard their cry in these words, and I consulted with myself. And he began to, talking to himself. He said, how could people do this? He's wondering, what in the world were they thinking? He says, and I consulted with myself, and I rebuked the nobles and the rulers, and I said, you exact interest on everyone as brother. He says, and I held a great assembly against them. And their own brothers were lending to others and charging them interest. And he goes through, and you can read the story, and that's not my point here because I'm going to come into it later. But what I wanted to do is give you the idea of what the people were in the middle of, and they're conditioned. So now, back in Nehemiah chapter 2, where we were, in verse 17. And this, the reason I went to chapter 5, it says, in verse 17 of chapter 2, then said I unto them, you see the distress we are in. Well, that's what distress they were in. They were in terrible shape. They had no food, no clothing. They were being sold as slaves. He's telling the leaders. He says, you see the condition we're in, and how Jerusalem lies in waste, and its gates are burned with fire. Come, let us build the wall of Jerusalem, that we be no more a reproach. In other words, he said that if you're going to overcome this, you got to build your walls to protect. You must fortify. And the principle for us, looking forward to the end time, before the return of Jesus Christ, the conditions are going to be like we're reading here in the book of Nehemiah, that the only way we're going to overcome this is to fortify our walls. And what are they? They're spiritual. They're not a building. They're not a gate. It's not a city. It is the temple of God, which is you and I, which are His people. That is what's got to be fortified, His people. Remember John the Baptist. He says his job was to prepare a people to make ready them for the God. To make ready a people for Jesus Christ. That's the job that you and I have as God's people, is to make ready a people. One of the lessons here in the vision that you and I must have, like Nehemiah, is to know that Jesus Christ is coming back, that the conditions of Jerusalem, this world, God's people, is in ruin. There was a time that the work of God was powerful. It was on 300 TV stations around the world. Millions and millions and millions of booklets went out every single month. There was not a time at some place on the earth that you couldn't turn the TV on and see the work of God going out. Well, for the last 20 to 30 years, we've done a pretty marvelous job at just destroying it. Break apart and break apart. In fact, there's so many different breaks aparts now, there's almost not another name left. At some point, the work of God's got to come together to accomplish a task. And let it begin, as Nehemiah says, with us. Search our hearts. Search our souls. Purify us. Whatever sins there are, remove them. And take them away. And give us a chance to start afresh. And so now he begins to tell them what God has put in his heart. And I told them the hand of my God which was good upon me, and also in the king's word that he had spoken to me. And they said, let us rise up and build. God had inspired them so much that when he told them what they had to do, they came together and they said, let us rise up and build. And so they strengthened their hands for this good work. But when Sanballat, the Horonite, and Tobiah the servant of the Ammonite, and Gershom and the Arabian heard it, notice now the names begin to increase. And I'll talk about that a little bit later in another sermon, how obstacles will continue to arise to stop the work. But you notice now, it was just a couple people before. Now they went out and they gathered more people to try to stop the work. They laughed at us to scorn, and they despised us, and they said, what is this thing which you do? Will you rebel against the king? See, they didn't know that the king had already given Nehemiah permission to do this job. So they laughed and they mocked. And people are going to do that about the work of God. They're going to laugh. They're going to mock us to scorn. Who are these feeble people, as we're going to read later, that think they can do the work of God? And they'll look and compare themselves against these mighty churches with 10, 20, 50,000 people. Or like some of the Protestants in the Catholic Church, 100 million people out there. And they're going to look at the work of God saying, who are these feeble people? So we think God, He's not into numbers. He's into work and the integrity of the heart. And here we have one man that God raises up and inspires to get out and to do a work and to restore Jerusalem and prepare it for the coming Messiah. To fulfill the prophecies in Jeremiah and Daniel. In verse 20, and I answered them and said unto them, the God of heaven will prosper us. Therefore we his servants will rise and build, but you have no portion, nor right, nor memorial in Jerusalem. And God will raise up his church, and they will do the job. And those that are without, who want to reproach, to attack, to berate, to lie, and to try to destroy, will have no part of the coming kingdom of God. Now, I want to close this one with chapter 3 and verse 1, just as a little tidbit to get you thinking about to the next sermon. They begin to build, you see the high priest rises up with the brethren, and they begin to build at the sheep's gate. Why do you think that is? Why build at the sheep's gate? And how does the high priest enter into the picture here? Now, I'm not going to give you the answer this time, but in the next sermon, Nehemiah chapter 3, we will cover that as the building begins in Nehemiah, as we cover his next category of his personality in Nehemiah part 3.